My name is Elizabeth Warren. I'm 39, and I never expected to be sitting in a police interrogation room watching my cousin, David, lie through his teeth about a hit and run that killed 2 people. Look, Detective Morrison, my cousin Beth here, as well. She's not exactly reliable when it comes to remembering details, David said, gesturing dismissively toward me. She's been struggling since she lost her job a few months ago. Drinking a bit too much. You know how it is. I sat quietly in the metal chair, watching David perform his act. He'd always been the golden child of the family. Successful real estate developer, big house in the suburbs, married to a doctor. The kind of nephew my aunt bragged about at every family gathering, while pointedly avoiding mention of my career. Detective Morrison looked between us. Ms. Warren, you called in the tip about your cousin being involved in the hit and run on Highway 9 last Tuesday night. I did. David laughed, but there was something strained about it. Beth's been having a rough time lately. Lost her government job. Can't find steady work. I think she's been watching too many crime shows. Detective, getting confused about reality. The irony was thick. For 12 years, I'd been living in what most people would consider the ultimate reality. Life or death situations where split-second decisions determined whether operations succeeded or failed, whether people lived or died. But to David, I was just his unemployed cousin who couldn't distinguish fiction from fact. The government job, Detective Morrison said, making a note. What kind of work was that? David answered before I could. Some low-level administrative thing, filing papers, answering phones, nothing important. She got let go during budget cuts, which tells you something about her work ethic. I'd been with the CIA for 12 years, but to my family, I was just Beth, who worked somewhere in DC and couldn't talk about the details. When operational security required me to tell them I'd lost my job, they'd assumed it was because I was incompetent, not because I'd been reassigned to a deep cover program that required complete civilian identity. Beth, David continued, leaning forward with fake concern, I know you heard about the job situation, but making up stories about family isn't going to help you feel better. Maybe you should think about getting some professional help instead of bothering the police with fantasies. Detective Morrison studied me. Miss Warren, what makes you think your cousin was involved in this accident? I saw his car the morning after. Front end damage, fresh scratches along the driver's side, consistent with sideswiping a bicycle, paint transfer that looked like it came from metal contact. David's expression shifted slightly. She thinks she saw my car, he corrected quickly, but like I said, she's been drinking. Her judgment isn't exactly sharp these days. Plus, Beth's always been dramatic. Even as kids, she made up elaborate stories to get attention. That hit harder than I expected. As a child, I had been imaginative, always reading spy novels and dreaming about adventure. The difference was that I'd actually lived those adventures for over a decade, while David had spent his adult life selling overpriced condos to suburban families and cheating on his wife. Detective David said, settling back in his chair with practiced confidence, I hate to say this about family, but you need to understand what you're dealing with here. Beth's always been the problem, child. Never finished college, bounced around from job to job, never married, no kids. She's almost 40, and she's got nothing to show for her life, except a string of failures. I felt that familiar knot in my stomach, the same one I'd carried through years of family gatherings where David held court, describing his latest business successes, while I sat quietly, unable to discuss my actual work. Every Christmas dinner, where Aunt Margaret would ask why I couldn't find a nice, stable job like David's. Every wedding where relatives would whisper about poor Beth who couldn't get her life together. Where were you Tuesday night, between 1000 p.m. and midnight? Detective Morrison asked David. Home with my wife. We watched a movie, went to bed early. Sarah can confirm that. David's voice was steady, practiced. We were watching that new Netflix series. What's it called, honey? The one about the lawyers. I knew Sarah would confirm it. Sarah had been confirming David's alibis for years. The nights he spent with his mistress in the downtown apartment he thought no one knew about. The weekends he gambled away their savings at Atlantic City. The business trips that were really vacations with his girlfriend from the office. Sarah was exceptionally well trained in backing up David's lies, mostly because the alternative was admitting her perfect marriage was a facade. Beth, David said, turning to me with theatrical sympathy. I know you're going through a hard time. Unemployment is tough, especially at your age. But accusing family members of serious crimes isn't the answer. This isn't going to make you feel better about your situation. My situation? Well, you're pushing 40, and you've never really established a career. Never married, no kids, living paycheck to paycheck when you were working. It's got to be depressing watching everyone else succeed while you're still trying to figure out what you want to do with your life. Detective Morrison was taking notes, but I could see him watching the dynamic between us carefully. Ms. Warren, do you have any evidence beyond the vehicle damage you observed? Before I could answer, David jumped in again. Detective, you should know that Beth has always been jealous of family members who've been successful. She's never forgiven me for doing well in business, while she struggled with basic employment. At family gatherings, she gets this look like she resents everyone who's accomplished something with their lives. The memory hit me unexpectedly. Last Thanksgiving, sitting at Aunt Margaret's dining room table, while David described his latest real estate development project, the way he turned to me and said, "Beth, you've been awfully quiet. How's the job hunt going? Still looking for something that matches your skill level?" The way the whole table had laughed, thinking they were being supportive, while actually highlighting my apparent failure to launch. "I haven't struggled with employment," I said quietly. "Beth, losing a government clerical job after what, 3 years? That's struggling? That's the definition of struggling. 12 years. David paused. "What? I worked for the government for 12 years, not 3. David recovered quickly. "Right. Well, even worse then. 12 years of filing papers, and they still let you go. That says something about job performance, doesn't it, Detective?" Detective Morrison looked at me. 12 years is a significant tenure. What exactly did you do for the government? David laughed before I could answer. "Go ahead, Beth. Tell him about your important government work. I'm sure the detective would love to hear about your filing system innovations." I looked at David's smug face, thinking about all the times he'd made those little comments. The family barbecue, where he had introduced me to his business partners as my cousin, Beth. She works in some government office building. The wedding reception, where he told the bride's father that I pushed papers for bureaucrats, while he created real value in the private sector. I worked in intelligence. I said intelligence, David repeated mockingly. "Right, like I said, detective fantasy world. Beth reads too many spy novels. She probably thinks she's some kind of secret agent. I am." The room went completely silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of phones ringing in the precinct beyond the closed door. Detective Morrison put down his pen slowly. "You're what?" "I'm an intelligence officer with the Central Intelligence Agency." David's grin faltered, but he tried to maintain his composure. "Beth, come on. This isn't helping your case." "Detective, she's obviously having some kind of breakdown. Clandestine service 12 years, currently between assignments." Detective Morrison studied my face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "Can you verify that?" I reached into my purse and pulled out my credentials. Not one of the cover identity cards I carried on operations. Elizabeth Chen, freelance photographer. Beth Williams, graduate student. Lisa Martinez, non-profit worker. But my real identification. Detective Morrison read the card, then looked up at me with a completely different expression. His entire posture changed. "Miss Warren, I'm going to need to step out for a moment to make some calls." After he left, David stared at the credentials on the table. That's fake, right? Some kind of elaborate joke. Did you buy that online? It's not fake, but your work in filing in some boring government office building. You told us you couldn't talk about it because it was classified filing or something mundane like that. I told you I worked for the government and couldn't discuss the details. You decided that meant filing. David's face was cycling through expressions. Confusion, disbelief, then something approaching panic. You work for the CIA, like the actual CIA. I work for the CIA, but you're always broke. You live in that tiny apartment in Arlington. You drive that 15-year-old Honda. You shop at Target instead of Nordstrom. Cover identity requires living below your means. Can't exactly drive a BMW to a meet with arms dealers in Somalia. Arms dealers, Somalia. David's voice cracked slightly. Among other places, Yemen, Afghanistan, Colombia, wherever the work takes you. David was quiet for a long moment, processing all those times you disappeared for months. When you missed Christmas 2 years ago, and Easter last year, I was working. And when you couldn't make my wedding anniversary party because of that sudden work trip, I was working. Jesus, Beth, the work trip to Chicago that lasted 3 months wasn't Chicago. David ran his hands through his hair. Why didn't you ever say anything? Why let us all think you were what? A failure? Incompetent? Unable to hold down a real job? We didn't know. You didn't ask. When would I have said something? David, during the family dinners, where you spent an hour bragging about closing another condo deal, when you were telling everyone how I needed to get my act together and learn from your example, when you were explaining to your business partners that I was the family disappointment. But I didn't know what you actually did. You didn't want to know. It was easier to assume I was a failure than to consider that maybe there was more to the story. Detective Morrison returned with another man in a dark suit. Ms. Warren, this is Agent Collins from the FBI. He's here to verify your credentials and coordinate jurisdictions if necessary. Agent Collins looked at my identification, then at me with the recognition of one professional to another. Officer Warren, I'm going to need to make some calls to Langley for verification, but your credentials appear authentic. They are authentic. David was looking back and forth between us, like he was watching a tennis match. Wait, jurisdiction. What does that mean? Agent Collins ignored him. Officer Warren, how long have you been stateside? 6 weeks debriefing period after an 18-month assignment. 18 months. David's voice was weak. You were gone for 18 months. I turned to him. You thought I was unemployed for 18 months. We thought, Mum thought, we all thought you were depressed about losing your job and didn't want to talk about it. I was in Southeast Asia, dismantling a human trafficking network. The words hung in the air. David looked like someone had physically hit him. 20 minutes later, Agent Collins returned from making his calls. He whispered something to Detective Morrison, who nodded and turned back to us with a completely changed demeanor. Miss Warren, your credentials check out. You're cleared for participation in this investigation at the federal level, if necessary. He turned to David. Mr. Patterson, I'm going to need to ask you some follow-up questions about your whereabouts Tuesday night, and I should inform you that you're now being questioned in the presence of a federal intelligence officer whose testimony carries significant legal weight. David looked like he was going to vomit. Wait, you're taking her seriously now? Just because she has some fancy ID card? Detective Morrison's tone had shifted to something much more formal. Sir, Miss Warren is a federal intelligence officer with 12 years of service and high security clearance. Her observational skills, memory for detail, and credibility are professionally established. But she's just Beth. She's the cousin who can't get her life together. She's Officer Warren, and she's provided us with detailed forensic observations about your vehicle's damage patterns that corroborate our physical evidence from the crash scene. I watched David's world crumble in real time. The paint transfer you mentioned, Detective Morrison continued, matches samples we scraped from the victim's bicycle. The scratch patterns you described are consistent with the impact trajectory our accident reconstruction team calculated. David turned to me desperately. Beth, you can't be serious about this. We're family. You can't destroy my life over an accident. An accident you fled from. 2 people died, David. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. You knew what to do. You knew exactly what to do. You just chose not to do it. Beth, please think about Sarah. Think about my kids. This will ruin everything. You should have thought about that before you hit 2 cyclists and drove away. Detective Morrison cleared his throat. Mr. Patterson, we have paint samples from your vehicle that match the victim's bike. We have tire track evidence from the scene. We have witness statements placing a vehicle matching yours in the area at the time of the incident. And now we have detailed testimony from a trained federal intelligence officer who observed your vehicle's condition the morning after the crash. This is insane, David whispered. Agent Collins spoke up. Mr. Patterson, I should also inform you that falsely accusing a federal officer of alcoholism and mental instability in order to discredit her testimony is itself a federal offense. I didn't know she was. I thought she was. You thought she was what? Detective Morrison asked. I thought she was nobody important. The words came out before he could stop them. Raw and honest and devastating. I stood up slowly. Detective, I've provided my statement and my contact information. Agent Collins has my security clearance information for any follow-up questions. If you need anything else, you can reach me through official channels. As I walked toward the door, David called out, Beth, wait, we need to talk about this. This is family business. I turned back to him. No, David, we really don't need to talk. but we're family. You can't just family doesn't try to destroy each other's credibility to cover up vehicular manslaughter. His face crumpled completely. I didn't mean for this to happen. The accident, it was just an accident. I was coming back from the office. I'd had a couple drinks with clients. The road was dark, but lying about it wasn't an accident. Driving away wasn't an accident. And trying to discredit me to protect yourself definitely wasn't an accident. I was scared. 2 people are dead. David, a father of 3, and a college student. They had families too. I left him sitting in that interrogation room, finally understanding that his nobody important cousin had more real authority and credibility than he'd ever imagined possible. 2 days later, David was arrested and charged with 2 counts of vehicular manslaughter, leaving the scene of a fatal accident and obstruction of justice. The local news covered it extensively. Successful real estate developer, pillar of the community, brought down by evidence provided by his own family member. They didn't mention my name or profession in the news reports, but the family knew. Word spread through our extended network like wildfire. Aunt Margaret, who'd spent years apologizing to friends for my lack of direction, called to stammer through an awkward apology. Uncle Frank, who'd lectured me at every family gathering about finding stable work and settling down, left a voicemail asking if we could clear the air about some misunderstandings. My mother called that evening, her voice careful and confused. "Elizabeth," she said, using my full name instead of the casual Beth the family had always used. "Margaret told me about what happened with David. She said you work for that. You're some kind of federal agent." "Something like that." "For how long?" 12 years. Mom, long silence on the other end. I could hear her breathing, processing. 12 years. "And you never told us." "I told you I worked for the government in a sensitive position. I told you I couldn't discuss the details. I told you it required extensive travel and irregular schedules. But we all thought, you thought I was nobody important. We thought you were struggling. We thought you needed guidance, support, help getting your life on track." I was struggling, Mum, with watching my family treat me like a failure because they couldn't understand what I actually do for a living. Another long silence. "Elizabeth, we had no idea. You had no idea because you decided what my life looked like without asking what it actually was. But you seemed so ordinary, so lost." "Mom, that's literally the point of my job. To seem ordinary while doing extraordinary things. To blend in, to appear unremarkable, to be underestimated." She was quiet for a long moment. Are you good at it? Your work?" I thought about the commendations in my classified personnel file, the operations that had saved lives, the intelligence that had prevented attacks, the networks I'd helped dismantle, the years of service that had kept my country safer, while my family worried about my inability to find real work. "Yes, Mom, I'm very good at it. I don't understand why you couldn't just tell us we're your family. Because when I tried to tell you it was important work that I couldn't discuss, you decided that meant it wasn't important at all. You decided that secrecy meant insignificance. The truth was that their judgment had hurt more than I'd wanted to admit. For 12 years, I'd carried their disappointment like a stone in my chest, wondering if maybe they were right about me being directionless, unfocused, incapable of real success or meaningful relationships. But their judgment was based on complete ignorance of what I actually did with my life. They'd been measuring me against standards that didn't apply to my reality, criticizing me for failing at things I'd never tried to achieve. I hadn't failed at anything. I'd succeeded at things they couldn't even comprehend. The most satisfying part wasn't David's arrest, though. That felt like justice for the family he destroyed with his reckless driving and cowardice. The most satisfying part was watching their entire narrative about me collapse when faced with the truth. For 12 years, I'd been the family disappointment, the cousin who couldn't get her life together, couldn't find meaningful work, couldn't live up to David's example of success and stability. Now, David was facing 40 years in prison, and I was a decorated federal officer whose testimony had brought him to justice. There's something profound about realizing that the people whose approval you've been seeking don't actually understand you well enough to judge you. Their disappointment wasn't based on my actual performance. It was based on their assumptions about what success should look like. I didn't need their validation anymore. I had my superiors' confidence, my governance trust, and my own knowledge of what I'd accomplished in service to something larger than myself. That was enough, but there was deep satisfaction in watching David's world crumble, as he realized that his loser cousin had more real power and authority than he'd ever possess. There was justice in seeing my family's assumptions shatter when faced with the truth about my service, and there was profound peace in finally understanding that their judgment of me said everything about their limitations and nothing about mine. I had spent years feeling guilty about not living up to their expectations, about missing family events, about not having the kind of life they could understand and approve of. Now I understood that their expectations were irrelevant. I'd been living up to much higher standards they couldn't even see, let alone meet themselves. David had built his sense of superiority on the belief that I was nobody important. Finding out that I was somebody very important, somebody with the authority to destroy his entire life with a single phone call, had shattered more than just his legal defense. It had shattered his entire understanding of who held real power in our family, and that understanding could never be rebuilt.